The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtroom as Judge Patricia Whitmore prepared to deliver the most significant verdict of her 30-year career. Outside, London buzzed with its usual energy, completely unaware that within these oak-paneled walls, a decision was about to be made that would send shockwaves through the very foundations of British society. Sarah Matthews, a 34-year-old former Royal Protection Officer, sat rigid in the defendant's chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wooden rail before her. For 18 months, the nation had followed her case with intense fascination and growing horror. The charges were unprecedented: conspiracy to commit treason, breach of the Official Secrets Act, and attempted harm to a member of the royal family. The case had begun when Sarah was discovered to have been secretly recording private conversations within Buckingham Palace. But what made her actions truly shocking was not just the breach of trust, but what investigators found when they dug deeper. Sarah had been systematically gathering information about King Charles's daily routines, his private medical appointments, and his personal security arrangements. The evidence suggested she had been planning something far more sinister than simple eavesdropping. Detective Inspector Michael Harrison had been the lead investigator on the case. A veteran officer with 25 years of experience, he had seen many cases that tested the boundaries of loyalty and betrayal. But nothing had prepared him for the complexity of Sarah's motivations. During the investigation, it emerged that Sarah had become involved with a radical group that believed the monarchy should be dismantled by any means necessary. The group, calling themselves the Republican Liberation Front, had been operating in the shadows for years. They had identified Sarah as the perfect insider, someone with access and opportunity. Sarah had initially joined the Royal Protection Service out of genuine admiration for the institution. She had been an exemplary officer for 7 years, earning commendations and the trust of her colleagues and superiors. But somewhere along the way, Sarah's perspective had shifted dramatically. Court testimonies revealed that she had become increasingly disillusioned with what she saw as the outdated nature of the monarchy. Personal financial difficulties had made her vulnerable to recruitment by the extremist group, who promised her substantial payment for her cooperation. The turning point in the case came when security cameras captured Sarah attempting to plant a small recording device in the king's private study. The device was designed not just to record conversations, but to monitor his movements and habits. Analysis of her computer revealed detailed plans that went far beyond surveillance. There were maps of the palace grounds, schedules of security rotations, and most chilling of all, research into the king's medical conditions and medications. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, the court-appointed psychiatrist who had evaluated Sarah, testified that while the defendant showed signs of stress and financial desperation, she was fully aware of her actions and their potential consequences. Sarah had not acted out of mental illness or confusion, but from a calculated belief that her actions were justified. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor James Wellington, had painted a picture of systematic betrayal that struck at the heart of British institutions. Wellington argued that Sarah's actions represented not just a personal betrayal of trust, but an attack on the stability and security of the constitutional monarchy itself. He emphasized that the evidence showed clear intent to cause serious harm to King Charles, though the specific nature of that intended harm remained partially unclear due to Sarah's refusal to fully cooperate with investigators. The defense, mounted by renowned barrister Catherine Richards, had attempted to portray Sarah as a troubled individual who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminal minds. Richards argued that Sarah's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of psychological manipulation and financial coercion, rather than deep-seated malicious intent. She pointed to Sarah's previously unblemished record and her cooperation with some aspects of the investigation. Throughout the trial, Sarah herself had remained largely silent. When she did speak, it was to express regret for her actions, but not to provide the full details that investigators and prosecutors had hoped for. Her refusal to name other members of the Republican Liberation Front had frustrated authorities, who believed there were still active threats that needed to be addressed. The media coverage of the trial had been intense and sometimes overwhelming. Every day brought new revelations and speculation about the extent of the conspiracy and whether other royal protection officers might be compromised. Public opinion had been sharply divided between those calling for the maximum punishment and those who felt Sarah deserved some measure of sympathy for having been led astray. Security experts had used the case to highlight ongoing vulnerabilities in the protection of the royal family. Professor David Hartwell, a former intelligence officer who now taught security studies, had testified that the case represented a fundamental breach that required extensive review of all protective procedures. The implications went far beyond one rogue officer. They suggested systemic weaknesses that could be exploited by others. As Judge Whitmore prepared to announce the sentence, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. Sarah's elderly parents sat in the public gallery, their faces showing the strain of months of public scrutiny and private anguish. Her mother had been particularly vocal in her belief that her daughter had been unfairly influenced by dangerous people, while her father maintained that Sarah needed to face the full consequences of her choices. Members of the Royal Protection Unit were also present, their faces grim as they awaited a verdict that would inevitably reflect on their own service and dedication. For many of them, Sarah's betrayal felt deeply personal. They had worked alongside her, trusted her with their own safety, and had considered her part of their extended family. The judge's chambers had been the site of extensive deliberation over the appropriate sentence. The case presented unique challenges, as there were few direct precedents for such a comprehensive breach of royal security combined with evidence of planned harm. Legal experts had debated whether the circumstances warranted the maximum possible sentence or whether mitigating factors should reduce the punishment. At precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, Judge Whitmore entered the courtroom for the final time in this landmark case. The packed gallery fell silent as she took her place behind the bench. Sarah Matthews stood as instructed, her face pale but composed, showing little emotion as she prepared to learn her fate. "Sarah Matthews," the judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "You have been found guilty of charges that represent one of the most serious breaches of trust in recent British legal history. Your actions have not only endangered the life of His Majesty the King, but have undermined the very institutions that form the foundation of our constitutional democracy." The judge paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing. "After careful consideration of all the evidence, the severity of your crimes, and the ongoing threat you may represent to national security, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years before you will be eligible for parole consideration." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, quiet sobs, and murmurs of approval or disapproval. Sarah's mother cried out and had to be supported by family members. Sarah herself remained standing, showing little visible reaction to the sentence that would likely keep her in prison for the remainder of her productive adult life. Judge Whitmore continued, "This sentence reflects not only the gravity of your actions, but serves as a clear message that attacks on our constitutional monarchy and the safety of the royal family will be met with the full force of the law. You had opportunities to cooperate fully with authorities and to demonstrate genuine remorse through complete disclosure of your activities and associates. Your failure to do so has been noted in the determination of this sentence." As court officials prepared to escort Sarah from the courtroom, news of the life sentence was already spreading beyond the building's walls. Television news crews positioned outside began broadcasting the verdict to a waiting nation, while social media exploded with reactions ranging from satisfaction to outrage. Within Buckingham Palace, a small television in a private office displayed the breaking news coverage. King Charles himself was not watching. He was in a meeting with senior advisors about upcoming state visits. But his private secretary, Sir Clive Morrison, had been monitoring the proceedings and was preparing to brief His Majesty on the outcome when the meeting concluded. The verdict represented more than just the conclusion of a criminal case. It marked the end of one of the most serious security breaches the royal family had faced in decades. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how such a betrayal had been possible and what steps would need to be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Detective Inspector Harrison, watching from the back of the courtroom, felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. While justice had been served, he knew that Sarah's continued refusal to fully cooperate meant that other members of the Republican Liberation Front remained at large, potentially planning new attacks on the monarchy or other British institutions. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, her life as she had known it effectively over, the full implications of her actions and this verdict were only beginning to unfold. The sentence would send ripples through the security services, the royal family, and British society as a whole. Sir Clive Morrison knocked gently on the mahogany door of King Charles's private study, his face bearing the weight of the news he was about to deliver. The meeting with the Commonwealth ambassadors had concluded just minutes earlier, and the king was now reviewing correspondence at his antique writing desk, a gift from his late mother that held particular sentimental value. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said softly as he entered the room, "I need to brief you on the Matthews case verdict." King Charles looked up from his papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. At 76, he had weathered many storms during his decades of public service, first as heir apparent and now as sovereign. But the betrayal by someone entrusted with his personal safety had affected him more deeply than he had initially allowed himself to acknowledge. "Please, sit down, Clive," the king said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "I assume from your expression that the verdict has been delivered?" Sir Clive settled into the chair, his hands folded carefully in his lap. As private secretary, he had served the royal family for over 15 years and had delivered both wonderful and terrible news. This moment felt particularly significant, not just because of the verdict itself, but because of what he had observed about his sovereign's reaction to the entire ordeal. "Your Majesty, Judge Whitmore has sentenced Sarah Matthews to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility," Sir Clive announced. The judge specifically noted the severity of the security breach and the ongoing threat posed by the defendant's refusal to fully cooperate with authorities. King Charles removed his glasses slowly and set them on the desk. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze drifting to the window that looked out onto the palace gardens. The afternoon sun illuminated the ancient oak trees that had stood witness to centuries of royal history, including moments of triumph and tragedy that had shaped the monarchy. "Life imprisonment," the king repeated quietly, more to himself than to his private secretary. "She was someone we trusted completely, someone who walked these corridors, who knew our routines, who was supposed to protect us." Sir Clive had expected relief or satisfaction at the verdict, but what he observed in King Charles was something more complex and deeply human. The monarch's face showed not vindication, but a profound sadness that seemed to encompass more than just this single case. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive began carefully, "the Security Review Board has already begun implementing enhanced screening procedures. Commissioner Bradley assures me that measures are being put in place to prevent any similar breaches." King Charles stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that those who knew him recognized as a sign of deep contemplation. "Clive, when I was a young man, my mother used to tell me that the crown is both a privilege and a burden. She said that we must always remember that our safety depends not just on protocols and procedures, but on the fundamental decency and loyalty of ordinary people who choose to serve." The private secretary listened quietly, recognizing that his sovereign was processing emotions that went far beyond the immediate circumstances of the case. Sarah Matthews was not born to wealth or privilege, King Charles continued. She chose a career in service to the crown. For 7 years, she did that job with dedication and skill. The reports in her file spoke of someone who took pride in her work, who cared about protecting not just the institution, but the people within it. Sir Clive had read those same reports during the investigation. They painted a picture of a competent, reliable officer who had earned the respect of her colleagues and superiors. The transformation from trusted protector to would-be conspirator remained one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. "What troubles me most," the king said, turning back toward his desk, "is not that someone tried to harm me. Threats come with this role, and they always have. What troubles me is that someone we welcomed into our trust, someone who became part of our extended family, felt so alienated from what we represent that she was willing to betray everything." Sir Clive had seen King Charles display remarkable composure during some of the most challenging moments of his reign. But this situation seemed to have touched something deeper, perhaps because it involved questions of personal trust and the human connections that made royal service meaningful. The king walked to a bookshelf lined with leather-bound volumes, many of them gifts from world leaders or important figures in British history. His fingers traced the spine of a particularly worn book, a collection of poems by Wordsworth that had belonged to his father. "Do you know what I keep thinking about, Clive?" King Charles asked. "I keep thinking about her parents. I saw them in the news coverage sitting in that courtroom day after day. They raised a daughter who chose to serve her country, who dedicated her career to protecting others. Now they're watching her being sentenced to spend most of the rest of her life in prison." This perspective surprised Sir Clive, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Throughout his years of service, he had observed King Charles's consistent concern for the human impact of royal decisions and events. Even in situations where others might focus solely on security or political implications, the monarch often demonstrated an instinct to consider the broader human cost. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said gently, "her actions could have resulted in serious harm to you and potentially to other members of the royal family. The sentence reflects the gravity of that threat." "Of course," King Charles replied, returning to his desk. "I understand the necessity of the punishment, and I don't question the judge's decision. But understanding the necessity doesn't eliminate the sadness I feel about how we arrived at this point." The king picked up a photograph from his desk, a formal portrait of the entire royal family taken the previous Christmas. His eyes seemed to focus on the faces of his grandchildren, the youngest members of a family that had been under threat from someone they had trusted. "I've been thinking about the security briefings we've received," he said, "about the Republican Liberation Front and their ongoing activities. Sarah Matthews was just one person. But she represents something larger, a level of anger and resentment toward the monarchy that we perhaps haven't fully understood or addressed." Sir Clive recognized the direction of the king's thoughts. Even in the aftermath of a serious security breach, King Charles was considering how the institution he led might need to adapt and respond to changing public sentiments. "The polls still show strong support for the monarchy, Your Majesty," Sir Clive offered. "Yes, but polls don't tell us everything," King Charles replied. "They don't tell us about the people who feel so disconnected from what we represent that they're willing to join extremist groups. They don't tell us about the economic pressures and social changes that make someone like Sarah Matthews vulnerable to recruitment by radicals." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Queen Camilla entered, her face showing concern as she approached her husband. "Charles, I heard about the verdict," she said simply. "How are you managing?" King Charles looked at his wife with an expression that conveyed both gratitude and exhaustion. "I'm struggling with what it means, my dear, not just for our security, but for what kind of country we're serving and how people see us." Queen Camilla sat in the chair recently vacated by Sir Clive, who had discreetly moved to give the royal couple some privacy while remaining available if needed. "I keep thinking about that young woman," King Charles continued. 7 years ago, she took an oath to protect the crown. She meant it when she said those words, I'm certain of that. But somewhere along the way, something changed so fundamentally that she was willing to risk everything to harm us. Queen Camilla reached across the desk and took her husband's hand. "You can't carry the responsibility for her choices, Charles. People make their own decisions, and she made hers." "I know that intellectually," the king replied. "But I can't help wondering if there were signs we missed, or ways we could have better supported our staff, or changes we should have made to prevent someone from becoming so disaffected." Sir Clive watched this exchange with deep respect for both monarchs. In his years of service, he had seen them handle numerous crises. But their response to this personal betrayal revealed character traits that reinforced his own commitment to the crown. King Charles stood again and walked to another window, this one facing toward the London streets where thousands of people were going about their daily lives, most of them unaware of the complex emotions being experienced within the palace walls. "I want to do something," he said suddenly, turning back toward his wife and private secretary. "I want to find a way to respond to this that goes beyond just accepting the verdict and increasing security measures." Queen Camilla and Sir Clive exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that indicated King Charles had reached a decision about something important. "What did you have in mind, Your Majesty?" Sir Clive asked. "I want to meet with experts who study radicalization and political extremism," the king said. "I want to understand better how people become disconnected from the institutions they once served, and I want to explore whether there are ways the monarchy can better engage with people who feel alienated from what we represent." This response was characteristic of King Charles, turning a moment of personal crisis into an opportunity for broader understanding and positive action. Sir Clive made notes as the king outlined his thinking. "I also want to do something for Sarah Matthews's parents," the king continued. "Nothing public, nothing that could be misconstrued as condoning her actions, but something that acknowledges their suffering and loss." Queen Camilla smiled sadly at her husband. "That's exactly what I would expect you to say," she said with obvious affection and admiration. The late afternoon sun was beginning to fade as King Charles returned to his desk, his mind clearly working through the implications of the day's events and his plans for moving forward. The verdict had been delivered, justice had been served, but for this monarch, the real work of understanding and responding to the underlying issues was just beginning. Within an hour of the verdict being announced, news of King Charles's unprecedented reaction began spreading through carefully managed channels. Palace insiders, speaking on condition of anonymity, revealed that His Majesty had not celebrated the life sentence, but instead had spent considerable time in private reflection about the broader implications of Sarah Matthews' betrayal. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when royal correspondent Victoria Hayes received a brief but significant statement from Buckingham Palace. Unlike the standard formal responses usually issued in such circumstances, this statement carried a personal tone that immediately caught the attention of seasoned royal watchers. "His Majesty acknowledges the court's decision and respects the judicial process that has concluded today," the statement read. "The King's primary concern remains the welfare of all those affected by these events, including the families who have suffered as a result of this betrayal of trust. His Majesty will be consulting with experts and advisors about ways to strengthen not only security measures, but also the bonds of understanding between the monarchy and all sections of British society." Victoria Hayes had covered the royal family for over 20 years, but she had never seen a statement quite like this one. Most royal responses to criminal cases involving the monarchy focused on security concerns and cooperation with law enforcement. This statement suggested something deeper was happening behind palace walls. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a senior palace source. The king is genuinely affected by this in ways that go beyond security. He's asking questions about how we failed this young woman and what we might have done differently. Meanwhile, in living rooms across Britain, families were discussing the verdict and its aftermath over evening meals. In Manchester, retired teacher Margaret Powell was explaining to her teenage granddaughter why the case had captured so much public attention. "It's not just about one bad apple," Margaret said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "It's about trust breaking down in ways that none of us fully understand. That young woman had everything going for her: a good job, respect from her colleagues, a purpose in life. Something went very wrong along the way." Her granddaughter, Emma, looked up from her phone where she had been reading social media reactions to the verdict. "People online are saying the king should be happy she got life in prison, but some are also saying maybe there were warning signs that got ignored." Margaret nodded. "That's the thing about these situations. They're never as simple as good versus evil. Real life is more complicated than that." Similar conversations were happening in pubs, offices, and schools across the country. The case had touched something deeper than typical royal news stories because it involved questions of loyalty, trust, and what happens when ordinary people make extraordinary bad choices. In the newsroom of the BBC, senior editor James Fletcher was coordinating coverage of the palace's unusual response to the verdict. His team had been tracking social media sentiment throughout the day, and the patterns were unlike anything they had seen during previous royal controversies. "The public seems genuinely interested in understanding how this happened," Fletcher told his evening news team. "They're not just looking for someone to blame. There's a real conversation starting about security, trust, and what this means for the monarchy going forward." Reporter Sarah Chen had been assigned to investigate the background of the Republican Liberation Front, the extremist group that had recruited Sarah Matthews. Her research was revealing a loose network of individuals who shared anti-monarchist views, but had previously never coordinated any serious activities. "What's interesting," Chen explained to Fletcher, "is that most of the group's online activity shows people who feel disconnected from modern Britain, not necessarily violent revolutionaries. Matthews seems to have been their first real attempt to act on their beliefs." This information was particularly relevant because it supported what palace sources were indicating about King Charles's response. The monarch wasn't dealing with a sophisticated terrorist organization, but rather with a group of disaffected citizens who had found each other online and gradually radicalized each other. Back at Buckingham Palace, the evening brought an unusual gathering in the king's private dining room. Instead of the typical dinner with family or visiting dignitaries, King Charles had requested a working meal with a small group of advisors and experts. Professor Helen Morrison from Cambridge University, an expert on political radicalization, had been asked to join the discussion. She had studied how ordinary citizens become involved in extremist activities and had written extensively about the psychology of betrayal in professional relationships. "Your Majesty," Professor Morrison said as the meal concluded and the serious discussion began, "what we're seeing with Ms. Matthews is unfortunately becoming more common across Western democracies. Economic pressure, social isolation, and exposure to extremist ideologies online can create a perfect storm that leads previously stable individuals to make dramatic life changes." King Charles listened intently, asking detailed questions about warning signs, intervention strategies, and whether there were ways that employers, including the royal household, could better support staff who might be vulnerable to radicalization. Dr. Michael Barnes, a former MI5 officer who now consulted on security matters, offered a different perspective. "Your Majesty, while Professor Morrison's insights are valuable, we must also acknowledge that no screening process can be perfect. Some individuals are simply skilled at concealing their true intentions." The conversation continued late into the evening, ranging from specific security improvements to broader questions about how the monarchy could better connect with citizens who felt alienated from traditional British institutions. Meanwhile, in a small house in Birmingham, Sarah Matthews' parents were trying to process the day's events while dealing with constant phone calls from journalists seeking their reaction to their daughter's sentence. "We knew this day would come," her father, Robert Matthews, told his wife as they sat in their modest kitchen. "But hearing those words, life imprisonment, it's still a shock." Margaret Matthews, Sarah's mother, had aged visibly during the months of her daughter's trial. "I keep thinking about the phone calls we used to get," she said quietly. "Sarah would call from work sometimes, so proud of what she was doing. She'd tell us about meeting important people, about feeling like she was making a difference." Robert took his wife's hand. "We may never understand how she went from that to this, but she made her choices, and now she has to live with them." The Matthews family had received a flood of media attention, much of it sympathetic to their position as parents caught between love for their daughter and horror at her actions. Some commentators had praised their dignity throughout the ordeal, while others had questioned whether they had missed warning signs of their daughter's radicalization. As midnight approached, the full implications of the day's events were still unfolding across British society. Social media analytics showed that discussions about the case were focusing less on the punishment and more on questions of prevention and understanding. A late-night talk show host opened his monologue with an unexpected take on the story. "Today, a judge sentenced someone to life in prison for betraying the royal family. But the real story might be how the king himself is responding, not with anger or revenge, but with questions about how we failed this young woman before she failed us." In university dormitories, students were debating whether Sarah Matthews deserved sympathy or condemnation. The discussions revealed generational differences in how young people viewed both the monarchy and the concept of institutional loyalty. "I'm not defending what she did," said James Harrison, a politics student at Edinburgh University, during a heated discussion with his flatmates. "But I can understand feeling disconnected from institutions that seem out of touch with ordinary people's struggles." His flatmate, Sophie Chen, disagreed strongly. "She took an oath to protect people, and she betrayed that oath. Her financial problems don't excuse planning to harm someone who trusted her." Similar debates were happening in academic circles, where experts on constitutional law, psychology, and security studies were analyzing the case from multiple perspectives. The complexity of the issues involved meant that simple answers were elusive. At dawn the next morning, King Charles was already in his study, reading briefings prepared by his advisors about public reaction to both the verdict and the palace's response. The polling data showed something remarkable. A significant majority of British citizens supported not just the life sentence, but also the king's apparent intention to use the case as an opportunity for broader reflection and improvement. One particularly striking statistic showed that 78% of respondents believed the monarchy should learn from this incident to better understand why some citizens feel alienated from royal institutions. This suggested that the public was ready for the kind of deeper conversation that King Charles seemed prepared to initiate. Sir Clive Morrison entered the study with the morning newspapers, most of which featured headlines about the compassionate king or the unprecedented royal response to the verdict. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said, "the editorial writers seem genuinely impressed by your approach to this situation. The Times is calling it leadership through understanding rather than vengeance." King Charles looked up from his briefing papers. "I'm pleased that people understand what we're trying to do. But the real test will be whether we can turn this terrible situation into something positive for the country." He paused, looking out the window at the London skyline. "Sarah Matthews will spend most of her remaining life in prison, and that's appropriate given the severity of her crimes. But if we don't learn something from how she went from loyal protector to dangerous conspirator, then we've missed an opportunity to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The morning brought news that the Republican Liberation Front's online forums had gone silent following the verdict, suggesting that the group was either disbanding or going deeper underground. Security experts were concerned that Matthews's refusal to cooperate fully with authorities meant that other members remained unidentified and potentially active. But the bigger story was emerging from polling data, social media analysis, and expert commentary. Britain seemed ready for a serious conversation about loyalty, trust, and how democratic institutions could better serve all citizens, even those who felt alienated from traditional power structures. King Charles's decision to respond to personal betrayal with institutional introspection had resonated with a public that was dealing with its own questions about trust in government, media, and other traditional authorities. His approach offered a model for how leaders could respond to crisis, not just with punishment and security measures, but with genuine efforts to understand and address underlying problems. As the sun set on this remarkable day in British history, it was clear that Sarah Matthews's life sentence was just the beginning of a much larger story about leadership, compassion, and the possibility of learning from even the most painful betrayals.